Bertelsmann Foundation to our event tonight, Media in the Disinformation Age. As many of you know, I'm usually based in Washington. The Bertelsmann Foundation is the sister organization of the Bertelsmann here in Germany. And my team and I, we focus on everything that's on the transatlantic agenda. Obviously, right now, everything from TTIP to Ukraine and Russia. And therefore, I'm delighted that we have an opportunity this evening to address an issue that could be defined as the missing link, so to say, between, in particular, Berlin and Washington, D.C., which is the question, how can both sides, Germans and Americans in particular, coordinate better and discuss how they can improve their media strategy to counterbalance the Russian media strategy when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And we have a stellar panel with us tonight. We have with us the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, Doug Frantz from the State Department. Warm welcome to Berlin. Doug has a stellar, or had a stellar career in journalism for almost 37 years. Before you joined the State Department, he worked for the Washington Post, the New York Times, where he also won with his colleagues a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on 9/11, as well as the LA Times, and he has written many books. And we have also with us Julian Reichelt. He is the editor-in-chief of Bild.de, and Julian has also covered many crises worldwide. And last but not least, I know Markus from his time when he was the bureau chief of the Handelsblatt in Washington, D.C., and he was also in the mid-90s for more than 5 years the correspondent of Handelsblatt in Moscow, and Markus has also covered other international crises like in the Middle East, for instance, and right now he has decided to train the next generation of journalists. He's right now professor at the Hochschule für Medien, Kommunikation and Journalism here in Berlin. Tonight's event obviously is on the record. As always, we welcome an active Twitter participation. You have on your seats these little Twitter handles that you can use in case you want to tweet about the event tonight. And without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Markus. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Annette. So we are going to do 30 minutes here on the panel, then we are open the floor for 30 minutes of Q&A. I also welcome you very much, and I'm looking forward to having a very lively debate with you, the audience. So let's jump into the first question. First question to you, Doug. We're going to see at the end of this week a major celebration, May 9th in Moscow. We're going to see a big parade, 15,000 troops on the Red Square. A new tank will be presented, the Armata 14, if I'm not mistaken. So is this all kind of smells like Cold War and another step in terms of propaganda, or is that something you can understand since the victory in the Second World War was something which cannot be underestimated from a Russian perspective? So what's your take on that one?
Well, first let me thank Annette and the Bertelsmann Foundation for inviting me here. I appreciate it, and it's great to have such a good-looking young audience. But on the question, I think the latter part of your question, Marcus, is important. I mean, 20 million Russians died in World War II. We can't underestimate the impact of that. Oh, I shut myself off. Okay, is that better? Oh, it's much better. I'll start with the good-looking young audience part again. I think that every country that was involved should be celebrating the 70th anniversary. But some of the things that we've seen coming out of Moscow would make you believe that it was only the Russians who won that fight. And so that's the part where the propaganda comes in. And that's the part where I think, subtly or not so subtly, there's a manipulation of this very important world event that we need to be at least conscious of. I arrived in Berlin last night from Riga, where I attended World Press Freedom Day, and I also spoke with a lot of Latvian officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other agencies. And I was in early April, I was in Tallinn and in Vilnius as well. And there's a common concern among those three countries. And partly their concern focuses on the efforts by the Russians to portray what happened in the Baltics in a different way, in a way that robs them of their role. But there's also a sense and an understanding that what we face now is not a new Cold War. And I hope it doesn't return to a new Cold War. But I think what we face now is a new kind of warfare coming out of the Kremlin. And it's been called many things, some of them apt. A hybrid warfare, the weaponization of information. But I think what it really comes down to is that the Russian propaganda machine is intent on reinventing reality. And that reinvention of reality occurs when they try to exclude people who fought for the victory in Europe, and when they try to claim that there are no Russian soldiers in Ukraine. I think we've seen that some of those are just flat lies, and we should call them that. One of the government officials in Latvia had an interesting phrase, said to me that Russians are the new peacekeepers. Mm-hmm. They take a piece and they keep it.
Well, we will be talking about the Russian propaganda machine a little later, but first of all, I would like to ask you, Julian, a question. You wrote recently in a story that was published in Politico that Russia has left the consensus of prospering, peace-loving nations and instead turned into the world's most dangerous aggressor. And you also said that the media has become an undeclared target of Putin's hybrid warfare. They are successful in far too many ways. Well, if I look at a survey that was done by Allensbach not too long ago, it seems like that this at this point doesn't stick with the German public. A clear majority was actually saying that the Russians are the culprits here, that blame has to be put on either the Russians or the separatists, and only a minor part actually on the US or even the European Union. So I'm wondering whether we are beating a dead horse here, actually, and maybe the propaganda simply doesn't stick.
Well, I think it's very easy to agree on that Putin is the culprit here, and that's obviously what many Germans see and many Germans then agree on. I think what's more important is to look at the consequences people are willing to accept for what Putin did, and when it comes to the consequences, which means sanctions, which means more NATO forces in the Baltic states, for example, people, especially in Germany, simply do not want that. I think if you look at the surveys when it comes to these tough questions, should we put sanctions on Russia, like energy sanctions, for example, that would hurt the German economy, severely hurt the German economy? Should we contribute to something like tripwire forces in the Baltic states? People will clearly speak out against that. I would argue, although I don't have a survey with me, I would guess with a strong majority. So it's kind of easy to look at what happened there and say, well, Putin is the culprit. What's important is what consequences are people willing to accept. And I think when it comes to, as soon as it comes to the consequences, as soon as it comes to the question, what should we do about it? People will fall into that argument that, yes, it was Putin who did all that, but we provoked him a bit. We messed with his, with Ukraine. That is his sphere of influence. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. You have to understand him. It has been, Russian sphere of influence for so long, and if the way we pushed in there, we should have consulted him and all that, and completely forget that. We just offered, the more attractive model to people in Ukraine, and that's why they turned westwards and not eastwards. And so I think that is the important point. That as soon as it gets, as long as it's easy, people will all agree that Putin did something wrong. As soon as it gets difficult, people will step back and say we have to understand Putin and not be too aggressive on him and not punish him too much for what he did there.
Well, wouldn't you say that maybe the way the European Union actually has handled the whole issue of association of Ukraine to the EU was maybe not the best way they did it.
Well, I think you can go into, it's always, one of the questions of, especially when it comes to propaganda is always, how do you break down things, and do you find, a small little detail where the EU or the West or NATO or whoever did something wrong and then capitalized on it. If you find the right detail, and if you're smart in doing propaganda, then that is what you're looking for. And I mean, it would be absurd to say that, that no mistakes were made on, our side or in the West or, as I said, NATO, EU, or whatever you want to call it. But I think the bottom line is that, all those people who went into Maidan Square went there because they saw something very attractive here. They saw when they looked westwards, they saw something very attractive. They saw, full employment in Germany. They saw, on most days, stable currency. They saw equal opportunity. They saw non-corrupt governments and all that. And when they looked eastwards, they saw an intelligent state. And there is a reason why many young Ukrainians want to go to Harvard or to a Freie Universität and don't want to go to university in Moscow. I think as Europeans, we should not forget that they turned towards us because we have something attractive to offer here. And I think with everything that is going on in the media, we tend to forget that too often.
I mean, Doug, not too long ago, well, a number of years, but not too many years ago, not far from here, Vladimir Putin was giving a speech at the Bundestag. And at that time, we thought that the relationship between at least Germany and Russia could be, even under the new circumstances, could become a pretty good one. Now, we turned out to be completely different if we look at the situation at this time. So what has happened? What went wrong in the past couple of years?
Well, I think it goes back a little longer than a couple of years. I think that, as with Putin's speech at the Bundestag, and the Germans' hope for the future, we all hoped that Russia would become a democracy. And certainly, 20 years ago, there were ample signs of a democracy that was growing in Russia. And one of those signs was a free and aggressive media. The shackles had been lifted, and there was this growing consensus that, you've got freedom of expression in Russia. And so slowly, we saw that begin to erode, and then in the last couple of years, we saw it erode dramatically. Dramatically. Who made the mistake? I don't know. Perhaps the Americans and the Germans and the others who thought that we'd won the Cold War and we pulled back our resources. Maybe we lost. Maybe we should have kept the pressure on. But I think rather than looking back at what went wrong, I think we really need to do what Julian has suggested, and that's look forward and what can we do now, not just to counter Russian propaganda, although I think that's an important topic, and that's what I think we're here to talk about tonight, but we also need to find the way that Putin is fanning the flames of anti-Europeanism and anti-Americanism within Russia and find a way to persuade the Russian people that we're not their enemies. If you look at the polls in Russia about attitudes toward Americans, I mean, we're in the bottom. We're lower than Congress in Washington. And, so we've got to find a way to address the propaganda, but we also need to find a way, I think, to address the deterioration of relations with Russia. We need to fix that. And, I will say that the United States government is not anti-Russian. We are engaged with Russia on many levels, on many important international projects. I mean, my boss, John Kerry, talks with Sergei Lavrov very regularly and very productively about the Iran nuclear negotiations, about finding a way out of Syria, about arms control. So this is not a completely broken relationship.
Now, since this here is a panel about Russian or about propaganda in general, but the Russian propaganda, now let's take a look actually what the Russians have been doing. I mean, we know that RT, the formerly known as Russia Today, has pretty much increased, actually intensified its coverage. They have a German channel, they have an international channel. We've seen the establishment of Rossiya Сегодня, which is a huge holding company where headed by Dmitry Kiselyov. He's a very outspoken Kremlin propagandist, I think one can say that. And we've seen Sputnik, a news agency that's disseminating pro-government news from Russia. And I could actually continue with that. I mean, we see Ruptly, which is a video news agency that is packaging information for channels or for programs actually to put in without the need to really put much work on it. So it's there's a lot going on here. So what are we doing to counter that? Or maybe a better question, have we to counter that? Or is that simply not the road we are going down here? Doug?
Absolutely, we have to counter it. The United States and Germany have to be partners in countering this because we're both targets. This is, I believe, a global problem, but it has local solutions. But before I get to that, I want to just add one thing to your list of evidences of propaganda, and that is that the Russians have driven so many quality journalists who believe in freedom of the press right out of their country. If they want to keep working as journalists, they've had to leave the country because the aggressive freedom of expression, free press there has been clamped down on in ways that you didn't expect, really. It's an authoritarian hammerlock on these groups. So I would add that. But it's global solution. It's global problem with local solutions. And what is the U.S. doing on that? Well, one, it's not for us to tell you what the truth is. We don't have necessarily an authentic voice to do that. But I think what we need to do is work with our partners, work with the EU, work with Germany, work with the Baltic states and other states along the periphery to create what I think is the front line of defense against all propaganda, and that is investigative reporting, solid journalism to go out and find the truth. Because what you see with this Russian disinformation campaign is an effort not necessarily to make us believe their parallel reality, but it's an effort to make us believe there is no reality. No, you can't trust RT, you can't trust Pravda, so you can't really trust the German media or the American media or the Ukrainian media either. So what happens when there's no trust in the media? People are confused, they begin to doubt their own governments, they begin to believe that there isn't a truth. But I believe there is. I spent 37 years as a journalist trying very hard to find the truth. And on some good days, I believe I found the truth. So I think journalism is important. So what is the United States doing? We're increasing our funding for training journalists in the kinds of skills that they need to uphold the ethics of journalism, to pursue the truth. We're not telling them what to write, what to publish, what to talk about, but we're helping to provide them with some of the skills. We're working with our allies in the region to help them build up Russian language channels that can counter the Russian propaganda, because I think one of the biggest threats here, and this is, as I said, I'm fresh from Riga and I was in Estonia and Lithuania earlier, and what they see there is it's Russian propaganda aimed at causing concern and doubts and fears in the Russian-speaking populations in all three of those countries. And you don't have to invade with an army when you're fighting a new kind of warfare here with information and with words, because that can matter. That can sow doubt in these young democracies.
Julian, you mentioned earlier the narrative about what happened in 2013 when the whole situation escalated with regard to Ukraine. It seems to me as if we haven't really succeeded in kind of countering that narrative. The narrative goes like that we have actually pushed them into the situation they are in right now because we pushed them into signing this agreement. The situation was a little bit more complicated than that. What went wrong in terms of news reporting here?
Well, what went wrong is something that I think Russia clearly sees and tries to capitalize on. It's the economic crisis many media organizations are stuck in, which leads to most media organizations not sending their own reporters to these areas anymore because it's just very expensive. I don't want to divert here, but Syria is another example where, because it's so expensive, many media organizations didn't send anyone anymore. So basically for 4 years we've heard it's all radicals, way before there were a lot of radicals, because that was just something that came out of well, something like propaganda. In that case, Assad's propaganda. With Ukraine, it's pretty much the same. I think it's very easy not to fall for propaganda. I think it's very easy to see through propaganda if you have your own reporters whom you trust on the ground telling you what's going on there. For example, we had our own reporter, or still have our own reporter there. He was in Crimea when the little green man showed up. It was obvious to us from day one that it was, Russian special forces. It should have been obvious to anyone. Unfortunately, it wasn't, because many major media organizations simply cannot afford to send their own reporters anymore, and that is something the Russian propaganda machine is very aware of, and that is why they have introduced models, some of which you mentioned with Raptly or RT, which is disseminating information that is very valuable, like video, at a very low cost, in many cases zero. And what they are doing is they put their brand on the most trusted brands of media. So I run it as a trusted media brand. I run their video. I get it for free, and at the end it has their logo, and they get they basically get the credibility from the media that runs their video, and by that give more credibility to their own brand, which the truth is a propaganda brand. And that is something that has happened a lot, and that is the main reason why that propaganda wasn't really countered by many media outlets. And I think the best example is that we have we are using, in many cases when we describe that conflict there, we are using their language. We are using the language of their narrative. We are using the East Ukrainian separatists. 90% of them are intelligence operators and Russian special forces, and not separatists. It's not Ukrainians who decided that they want to seek a better future in Russia. It's it's people, it's thugs guided by Russian intelligence and Russian special forces. We have started using the word civil war. There is no civil war in Ukraine. There are not Ukrainians shooting at Ukrainians for some ethnic grievance, for example, or a religious divide or something. That very rarely happens. I don't want to say it never happens, but it doesn't happen often enough to call it a civil war. It happens maybe often enough to call it murder, but not a civil war. Still, that that phrase civil war is used over and over again in Western media, because there is just no one to really question that narrative. And the truth probably also is, it makes it very easy to, you say the civil war in Ukraine, everyone, knows what you're talking or writing about, and you don't really see, the consequences that phrase you're using there has.
Can I add a point to that? Because when you raised, have we lost the narrative, sort of, I think what we're seeing here is a new kind of 21st century warfare. In the old days, propaganda took a long time to spread, whether it was the KGB or the CIA. It took a long time to forge the documents, to create new photos, to get it out there with the willing press, to put it out in the public, and then it took a while for it to spread beyond that. But what we see now is that there are cheap, quick, and very easy ways to get your propaganda out. And if somebody pokes a hole in your lies today, you simply come back tomorrow with another lie. And so there's this growing sense of who do you believe, this growing sense of distrust and mistrust, and we haven't countered it very effectively, that's for sure. And I've had meetings here all day. We talk about it at the State Department in Washington a lot. How do you counter this? There are ways to, but we're facing a new kind of hybrid warfare here that creates difficult problems, especially for governments that want to tell the truth.
Is the German perspective a particularly different one when it comes to Russia than if you compare that with other countries? I mean, I understand that you might think that Germans have a little bit of a soft spot when it comes to Russia and might be more forgiving. Is that something you experienced? Or?
Well, I would say honestly that the people in the Baltics seem far more concerned than the people I've spoken with here. I think Germany is, for one thing, a more secure democracy. It's a stronger democracy with a stronger economy. I don't feel that any German expects to be invaded That's not the way they feel in the Baltics. They're very concerned. For them, this is the potential of an imminent threat. You know, and what does an invasion mean? It doesn't necessarily mean you send battalions and battalions across the border, but it may mean that you send 100 little green men into one of the Russian-speaking enclaves there, and you can create the kind of problems that can quickly undermine these young democracies. So I do sense, and you know, this is my gut reaction. I do sense a greater fear there, for fairly obvious reasons, I think.
You a little bit bypassed my question, but
I did.
well,
I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask you about the Germans, not so much about the Baltics. But
Well, I thought I was comparing the Germans to the Baltics. You know, the Germans have strong economic ties with Russia, and that's all great. But I think the Germans, you know, I don't know, I think the Germans should be as concerned about the potential for where this winds up as any other country, you know, and because I believe that this global problem that I discussed is really aimed at transforming the world order that has been developed since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that will have an impact here. If you undermine NATO, if you undermine and weaken the EU, that will have an impact on Germany. So, you know, whether they're as concerned or not, I'm really not in a position to say, Marcus. I'm just in a position to say that I think that they should be. I'm not suggesting that they're targeted, but I'm suggesting that there are consequences that will have an impact on them, just as they will on Americans.
now, talking about impact, I mean, if we look at the current situation, the current relationship between Germany and the United States, if we look at the current scandal we're going through with the BND and the NSA, I mean, this is something that is not really helping in forming mutual trust, and actually it's playing into the hands of Russian propaganda. Would you agree?
Yes.
Any more comment on that?
That's a difficult question for me to ask. It's easy to poke at the Russians, not so easy perhaps to discuss the NSA-BND relationship. I mean, what I will say is that there is a recognition in the United States that after 9/11, we swung the pendulum too far toward surveillance. We became, I believe, almost paranoid about the threat of terrorism. I think we should be deeply concerned about the threat of terrorism. All of us should be. We see evidence of it every day. But I think the pendulum swung too far that way. I think it's slowly beginning to swing back. We have a great debate in Congress now, one of the rare bipartisan debates that we've had in many, many years in Congress, over how far we can bring it back, how much more protection we need for civil liberties. And as President Obama said about surveillance, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I think in those immediate years after 9/11, there was this collective sense, well, we should. We better protect ourselves. And now reality is coming to bear. You know, that said, I think that Chancellor Merkel has said it well too. There's always a tension between surveillance and civil liberties. You know, we need to find the right spot in that tension, and we need to find the right spot in our relationship with Germany. But the cooperation between Germany and the United States in counterterrorism is vital to protecting everyone in this room and everyone else in the world from terrorism. And that cooperation shouldn't be held hostage to what people are calling a scandal.
If you want, maybe just want me to slightly disagree with, you know, just
Sure.
because you said, is this, you know, the whole BND NSA thing playing into Russia's hands? I think, you know, it's playing into Russia's hands is simply not the right way to look at. You know, Russia is at least a part of, you know, because the whole BND NSA affair obviously, you know, was triggered by the Snowden documents. And, you know, without going into any, you know, anything that sounds like a conspiracy theory here, I personally, till today, find it absolutely mind-blowing how people can think that Snowden ended up in Moscow, you know, from sheer coincidence, and that Russia plays no role at all in controlling the documents he holds. I think it may be a minor part, but I simply find it very hard to believe that they just, the most anti-free press, anti-freedom of information, major regime in the world takes in an activist just out of, good faith and because he's looking for a new home, who's, coincidentally, sitting on the biggest trove of, highly classified intelligence information that is, has strong potential to undermine, transatlantic relations. They just take him in and let him sit there and do his thing. I still find that very hard to believe, and I think it's a good example of how we fall for a very convenient narrative that sounds very implausible.
So hopefully I find someone here who counters this narrative and is ready to ask a question. So who wants to be first? Gemma, please.
My name is Gemma. I'm a German journalist specialized in Russia, and I would be interested in the situation in the United States, because you have Russia Today, like a really TV program, which is very different from the situation in Germany, where Russia RT Deutsch only is possible to see in the internet. They didn't reach actually a big audience. It's quite small. So in a way, there's more success to Russian propaganda in the United States, if you want so. And there have been really prominent figures in journalism who actually changed and decided to work with Russia Today. So I would be interested how you analyze the influence of Russia Today in the United States.
Sure. This is a good question. Thank you. I think the influence of Russia Today in the United States is minimal, and perhaps less than minimal. I think that people who bother to watch it, and that I would say is a small number, recognize that this is propaganda. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have some impact on the margins. It does, but I don't think it's a very large impact. Sometimes I worry more about the impact of the propaganda on Fox News. I hope that we're a sophisticated enough audience to not fall for this, because it does get so blatant. And if you'll remember, after the invasion of Ukraine by these little green men and other Russians, there were a number of prominent Russia Today anchor people and news people who resigned in protest over being told how to present the news. Now, there's always going to be somebody willing to take that spot, particularly when you have so many out-of-work journalists in the United States. There's always somebody there. And similarly, there's always somebody there willing to go on that show and pretend that it's real news. I saw a guy I used to work with in the Senate on there a couple of weeks ago, and I was stunned, and I wondered, what in the hell is he doing on there? And then I realized he was plugging a book, and when people are plugging books, they'll go anywhere. But I don't really believe that it's a strong factor in the United States. And unfortunately, I also don't believe that the American public, by and large, is paying sufficient attention to what's happening here, to what's happening and what the potential consequences are of this disinformation campaign, and what the consequences are if NATO is weakened. What happens if there is an incursion in a small part of Estonia? Are we going to invoke Article 5? Is there the political will to do that? And if not, what happens to NATO then? So I think the stakes are high, and I wish in a way that the Americans were paying more attention to it, and that's one of our jobs at the State Department. But I don't see Russia Today as much of a factor at all. I think in a lot of ways the Russians are wasting their money there. And I don't mind seeing that either.
All right. Who wants to ask? Please.
Thank you. You were.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Isabel Hoffman, working for Bertelsmann Stiftung as well. I was wondering, you were referring to the lack of concern of the Germans towards the possible outcomes of this crisis. So I was wondering, while you were elaborating on that idea, do you see, were you referring only to the general public? Were you also referring to the German government? And if so, do you see a lack of concern there as well?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify that and keep myself out of trouble. I was not referring to the German government. I was referring generally to the population and the conversations that I've had, including conversations that I've had with journalists over the last day. I mean, I had a lunch with several journalists today, and I was surprised when I described this as a threat. One of these journalists was gravely offended, and she said, there is no threat here. You can't look at this as a threat, you know? And I'm not saying, I don't know how representative she is of the German populace. I mean, I've been reading a fair amount, you know, and I think that there are, as Marcus indicated in his first question, there is a sense of kinship that still exists here, and that's fine. That's as it should be. We're not trying to deny that, but you know, I do think that the attitude here is certainly different than the attitude that I've experienced in the Baltics, for instance.
The gentleman over here, please.
As you mentioned the Baltics, if you compare the situation in the Baltics 20 years ago and how we as professional journalists reacted, and today you would notice a real big difference. See, our industry is going through a crisis, and we have no strategic attitudes towards the crisis itself, also not towards the threat which comes from outside. I mean, Julian is one of the most favorite writers in this country. He's one of the few who has resources to send people out. Most papers don't do this anymore. They did it in the Baltics. I had about 25, 30 colleagues I knew. I could call them anywhere, on both sides, by the way. Today in the Ukraine, there is almost nobody. Even our news agencies, the APR reports all the time nonsense because they are far away. They report from Kiev or sometimes even from Moscow about the situation on the front lines. So the deeper question would be perhaps how this industry can get back its strength, its ability to do what it should do in the opinion building process, and how government should not be involved. Who is the agent who is responsible for this process where we get back the strength I felt 25 years ago. 25 years ago, we would have had a totally different outcome, I'm sure. We would have sent hundreds of people there, interested, freelancers. We wouldn't have these insurance problems which we have today. I mean, one of the biggest problems for news organization is how you get covered those people, you know? And there's a strategy by conflict parties to target journalists because it wants them to be out of the area. And perhaps government could help with this thing. Perhaps they could find ways to diminish the risks news organization takes.
Thank you. Just one more thing. Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Johann Legner, and I'm a former journalist.
All right. Thank you.
I'm a former journalist, too. You know, there are things that governments can do. But as a former journalist, there's not much I want government to do. This is the problem of journalism. It's the problem of the economics of journalism. But in the U.S. government, particularly in the State Department, we are doing a couple of things. We held a conference in January to look at how can we improve the security for freelancers and local reporters, the people who are the most vulnerable reporters on the front lines, the people most likely to be kidnapped or killed. You know, and there are things that we can do. We can work with our embassies worldwide to make sure that the impunity that comes with killing a journalist or injuring a journalist, it disappears. 90% of the crimes against journalists are never prosecuted. 90%. And that's outrageous. That's unacceptable. So one of the things we're doing at the State Department is looking for ways to elevate that as a bilateral issue in our conversations with every government around the world, and particularly with governments where they routinely allow journalists to be killed or jailed or intimidated in other ways. You know, so that's something a government can do. A government, as we are, can increase the funding it provides for training journalists in terms of how to behave safely, how to deal with a conflict zone. I mean, when I covered my first war in 1991, the first Gulf War, I was able to do that at the side of a veteran reporter at the Los Angeles Times who had covered many wars since Vietnam. You know, and so I learned from him, and I learned, you know, it helped develop my radar for where to go and where not to go. Unfortunately, those veterans have disappeared too often. Veterans like me are doing other things, unfortunately. And so you have freelancers and you have young reporters who don't have the experience and get themselves into trouble. So they get killed, so nobody else is willing to go there. I mean, if you look at Syria, we're depending on citizen journalists in Syria to get out the news of that humanitarian catastrophe. And I think, God bless them, they're as brave as they can be. But the absence of professional journalists in Syria is one reason why the world can turn away from that crisis, why we can watch more than 200,000 people die in a civil war and not give a damn. I mean, the United States is devoting a lot of humanitarian aid to Syria. Other countries are too. But there is so much more we could do. And we're not motivated, in large part, I think, because we're not paying attention, because the press isn't in there. And the Assad regime and al-Nusra and ISIS have done a great job of isolating that field of battle for themselves.
Yeah, before coming to the next question, I would like to ask one more question to you, Julie. You were talking about Russian propaganda, the way actually they do it and the way they frame it. I mean, don't we have to be very careful not to fall in the same victim to kind of the same strategy? And I mean, Bild is not known for being very mild, actually, if they found someone they don't like, that's shown. So in a way, aren't we in danger, actually, of kind of paying back in the same coin, you know, just...
Well, you know, I think in general, journalism is always, that's, you know, part of, you know, the definition of journalism, in danger to fall for lies, false narratives, propaganda, fake photos, you know, all that. That is just part of our job. I don't really think, yeah, and I agree, it is a thin line of, you know, being very clear about the things we see, being very clear in our language, and falling for something like activism, if that is what you're referring to. But I strongly believe in, you know, what makes a healthy media landscape is a variety of, you know, opinions, voices, all that. And, you know, I agree, you know, Bild can be very heavy-hitting, but, you know, there is also, you know, a variety of media that is, you know, I don't want to call appeasing in this conflict, but that is very mild on Putin, you know. So I think what we have in Germany is a variety of media, and that is what a healthy media looks like, where you have different opinions, and you know, you come up with an opinion from different sources of reporting, from different papers, television channels, websites, and all that. So, you know, I think it's important, and I couldn't agree more, that as long as we can, you know, as long as we have the money and the resources to send people, that we do that, and that we trust our own people. Because one mistake many, I think we have to blame ourselves there, many news outlets made, was that we didn't trust our own people. You know, we started trusting, you know, other sources more than our own. We started trusting big television networks more than our own reporters because it looked nicer. And we delivered a worse product by not trusting our own people. So I think the best thing we can do is, you know, if we have the resources, you know, dispatch people, send them there, hear what they say, and follow what they tell us from the ground.
But Julian, it seems to me that this is not really trusted what they are writing. I mean, I pulled up a couple of stories on Bild.de and also on other news outlets, and if you look into the commentary column, actually you see 80% of comments are actually pro-Russian. That's at least, or not pro-Russian, but have showing quite some understanding and criticizing the reporter. So there's a disconnect here.
Absolutely, there's a major disconnect. There are very interesting and very disturbing phenomenons like Lügenpresse, like trolls on Twitter. It's very difficult to get a sense of how representative, for example, the comment. If we have a story on Ukraine, and you're absolutely right, 80% of the story will be strongly pro-Putin and strongly anti-Bild to a level where we pass it on to our lawyers or to the authorities because it gets threatening. It's very difficult to get a sense of how representative that is because Russia is not only doing RT and roughly know that, they are also investing a lot in trolling both on social media and in the comment sections of news sites. But it would be wrong just to look at that professional side. I do believe that there is a sense that is a threat to what people call mainstream media. That for too long, people were just given an official narrative, and that is I'm not an expert there in the U.S., but I clearly see it in Germany, where people have that sense. And I don't really have an explanation where it comes from, that people were given the official line, the official narrative by mainstream media, because we were the only one who had the distribution channels to put out information there, with printing papers and distributing them all across the country. Now that people have access to social media, there is a sense that finally they are able to strike back, and that they can go to what they think is the source, and that they can get what they think is the truth. And it gives a tremendous uplift to conspiracy theorists, people who believe they have found something they can now prove that we were. I get accused of working for the CIA, the NSA, the German government basically on a daily basis. And people think they can somehow prove it because with social media they can work around and see behind the curtain. And it's very difficult to see where this sentiment is coming from. I think it comes in parts because, and that plays into the whole crisis of our industry. For decades, we looked at our circulation numbers and thought, wow, they are pretty high. The reason probably is that we are so smart, so great. We write very funny stuff. We write brilliant analysis, all that, and completely ignored that media and distribution was a monopoly. In Germany, it's handled by 5 families, 6 families, and we ignored that we had a monopoly. And now that monopoly is gone, everyone with a smartphone, has a global distribution system in his hands. And we treated people arrogantly. I think that is, part of the reason why they're turning away from us and now looking for the truth and better sources in the social media world.
So we get a couple more minutes, and Mr. Eichhorn.
Thank you, Christoph Eichhorn with the German Foreign Office. A quick question for Doug. You mentioned you're talking to the Baltic countries to help their media systems targeting the Russians in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. I think the Deutsche Welle is doing something similar. Yes. Could you try and explain a little bit what you're doing? And the question to Julian, if you were the editor-in-chief of, say, Estonia Public Television, what would be your concept vis-a-vis the Russian minority in Narva, etc., to get them sort of out of their sofa and switch to your channel rather than the Moscow-based channels, which they're watching all day and which they might like? The Russian, game shows, after all, are not bad.
Let me just make 2 points in response to that very good question, and that's a question we've been debating and asking ourselves at the State Department for some time. The first thing is, the easy thing is, we're increasing our training. Later this month in Riga, we will hold a technical camp for about 60 reporters throughout Eastern Europe, where independent journalists will come. We're helping to pay for it, but independent journalists will come and teach young investigative reporters how to use modern technology to be better reporters. We're increasing these sorts of camps. Again, we're not telling them what to do, what to report, but we're helping them learn the skills and standards that will make them better reporters. Because I think that the local solutions are going to come from solid, on-the-ground reporting from people in those countries who are believable. The second thing is, and this is a larger thing, and I spoke with two senior officials from Deutsche Welle just this afternoon about this. We're trying, let's take Estonia. Estonia has set aside a certain amount of money to create a second public broadcasting channel that will broadcast in Russian and be aimed at the 300,000 or so Russian-speaking Estonians who feel cut off from the country, who in some ways have been cut off from the country. So they're developing this network. But in order to compete with the game shows and the entertainment on the channels coming out of Moscow, they have to have a fully fledged network. They can't just have a handful of talk shows. And that's hard, it's expensive, it takes time, unless you get some help. So one of the things that we're doing is working with our colleagues here in Germany, working with some representatives of the EU, although I think that may be a blind alley, working with the Brits and working amongst ourselves to develop a cloud-based library of entertainment programs from the United States, from Germany, from Britain, from France, from Canada. Part of this is pie-in-the-sky stuff, but I think it can happen. That is translated into Russian, and networks around the periphery will be able, for very few pennies, to pull that down, decide what's relevant for them, and then fill out their local network so that they can attract viewers who will then get the local news, which we hope would be delivered more straight and in keeping with journalistic standards. So I think you touch on something very important. They have to get those viewers there, and those are a couple of the ways that we're trying to help them. And I think, Foreign Minister Steinmeier certainly recognizes this, and he's pledged more German money to help train journalists in the Baltics. Again, this is the United States and Germany, two great democracies working in partnership.
Well, I think no one really likes the news these days. It's very depressive, it's very dark, especially in one of those, if you live in the Baltic states with what's going on in Ukraine. And so to report, and people through digital journalism, Twitter, social media, all that, the attention span of people, the truth is very short these days. So you have to be, if you're not packaging news right, people will just turn away. If you look at American news networks, if you look at RT, it's very well packaged. And what you mentioned, they do have nice shows around it, so they can lead you from one news segment to the next without losing you. That being said, it's just impossible to counter, Russian resources, being one of these countries, or being an editor there, if you don't have a lot of money. So I think what we're really facing today is a situation where Western countries have to pledge money to these countries to do what the United States actually did in Germany after the war. Build their, don't tell them what to broadcast, but build their media scene, build their news outlets, so they are resourced well enough to report in a way that people will turn to their programs. Will they be accused of being influenced by the U.S.? Will they be accused of all that being U.S. propaganda? Of course. That's what's going to happen. That's what happened in Germany for Western German news outlets from these. Same will happen there. But I think there still is no alternative to having well-resourced free media. And as soon as free media is at a state where it can where it makes money, basically, I would always say that government should stay out of it as much as possible. And free media is nothing that should be subsidized by the government. But you know, there are cases. Well, the truth is, in Germany, it's also, you know, quasi subsidized by the government, and it's still the same concept. You know, it's and I believe that is some. You know, if I were that editor, you know, I would you know, go around Western Europe and probably DC asking for money and telling people that there's no way to match that Russian propaganda offensive if you know, you don't have well-resourced media.
Okay, I think we've got one more question over here, and then we'll slowly come to a close. Please, the mic's coming.
Thank you very much. My name is Bernd Liebrecht. I'm a frequent traveler to Russia. And I think in this audience, everybody knows that Putin is bad and that he invaded Crimea and all this. I think this is not needed to be discussed. What I would like to know, and this is what I'm missing in the Western media, is what really happens in Ukraine. My perception in Ukraine is that it's a completely failed state. And the reason for it is the leftover of the Soviet Union. And if you look at who is really governing Ukraine, there are 4 oligarchs who are doing that. And one of them, Mr. Pinchuk, the son-in-law of Mr. Kuchma, who was 10 years the president of Ukraine, is the richest guy in Ukraine. So he has a fantastic foundation. It's not as big as Bertelsmann, but the Pinchuk Foundation invites Western media, Western opinion leaders, Western, like the Clinton family is spending money for the Clintons. This is something what I'm completely missing reporting in the Western media. So what are we going to do with Ukraine? We are talking about spending money there. We are talking about integrating them into the EU. We are talking about integrating them into NATO. This is a completely failed state. If somebody has another opinion, I would be more than happy to listen to him.
I would
Thank
be
you.
happy to offer another opinion about Ukraine. It's not a failed state, and what happened was thousands of people went to the Maidan Square and demanded their rights. Now, is Ukraine Germany or Switzerland? No, it certainly isn't. There are problems there, but they're problems that are being addressed. They're problems we can see forward movement, and it makes sense for Western countries, including the United States, to invest heavily in helping fulfill the democratic aspirations of the people of Ukraine. It's a long, tough fight, but this is by no means a failed state. I've lived in failed states. This is not a failed state.
Yeah, I would agree there. If you want to see a failed state, you would definitely have to travel to another country, not to Ukraine. I was in, the truth is I was only in Kiev, so you know, it's obviously the capital. And the richest part, I was there I think 5 weeks ago. It's clearly not a failed state. It's very vibrant. You know, people are you know, scared of what's ahead, but people are also very optimistic and you know, they want to build a better future for themselves there. And you said something, what do we want to do with Ukraine? I don't think that is you know, the core question. The core question is, what do Ukrainians want to do with Ukraine? And they made that very clear. They don't want to be Russia. They want to be the West. They want to drive cars like us. They, you know, want to have an education system like us. They want to have non-corrupt government like us. That is why they went to Maidan, and that is why they turned westwards. They made very clear they want to be, you know, they want to be more like us than like, you know, Moscow these days, or even further eastwards. And I think what we clearly did is, or what the West did is, we encouraged them to do that. Now, I don't believe that we encouraged them to do that through a, you know, association agreement. I don't think anyone, you know, went out into Maidan and said, well, that association agreement is so great, you know, I will head to Maidan. People headed there because they are frustrated. If they have a good education, they won't get a good job because it's a corrupt state. And if they do get a good job, you know, they still don't have the life that people have here. And that is what they're aiming for. And of course, we encourage them by, you know, showing them, you know, what life can be like. And I think that's why we owe them, you know, supporting them now, you know, and it's not about that we choose the future for Ukraine. They chose for themselves, and they want to be Berlin and not Moscow, and I think that is something worth supporting.
So this was a pretty passionate pledge for Western values. Maybe a fitting end to our debate. Or is there anyone who wants to use the opportunity to ask a question? If not, I thank you very much. And please continue your conversations over here in the back of this room. Thank you very much. Thank you.